On a cold October night, Seth Yancey is sheltering under an I-70 overpass near the Kansas River. The temperatures are dropping pretty fast, but he has a tent, a sleeping bag, his only set of clothes, and his backpack.
Right, his basic survival gear.
Exactly. Then, law enforcement officers approach in the dark, and without any prior warning, they tell Seth that his campsite is illegal. But instead of, offering him a chance to pack up his gear and move along, the officers just cut his tent open.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in a matter of minutes, they completely destroy his belongings.
That is just an incredibly visceral, devastating moment, because when you are living outside, that tent and that sleeping bag are not just camping equipment. That is your entire safety net. I mean, it is the only barrier between you and hypothermia.
Right, so if you are Seth, what happens next?
Right.
Where do you go when the only things keeping you alive are gone? And that question is basically the foundation of our deep dive today. We are building the perfectly homeless state score for Kansas.
Which is going to be super interesting.
Yeah, we really want to understand exactly how this state treats its unhoused population, looking past the political rhetoric to examine the actual policies, the enforcement, and the daily realities on the ground.
And to do that, we are going to evaluate Kansas across 6 distinct areas. So we have housing affordability, shelter access, criminalization enforcement, vehicle dwelling friendliness, outreach and social services, and lastly, pathways to permanent housing.
And just a quick reminder, we will not reveal the final score until the very end, so you will want to stick with us for that. So let's start by looking at the sheer scale of the situation. In January 2024, the point-in-time count, which is exactly what it sounds like, just a physical count of people experiencing homelessness on a single night, found 2,815 people in Kansas.
Okay.
And that is actually a 6.8% increase from the previous year.
But you kind of have to take those official numbers with a massive grain of salt. Local advocates and outreach organizations estimate that the true number of unhoused people is actually 3 times higher than that official count.
That makes total sense, because the count happens in the dead of winter. We've talked about this before in the show. It's like taking a snapshot of a crowded, pitch-black room using a really small flash.
Yeah, you only see what's right in front of you.
Exactly. You are only going to see the people standing right next to the camera. You completely miss the couch surfers, the people who are temporarily doubled up with family, and the hidden vehicle dwellers who are parked in industrial lots just trying to stay out of the freezing wind.
Right, and the most revealing part of the data, honestly, is the geographic distribution. There is this deeply ingrained assumption that homelessness is purely an urban issue. Like, you automatically picture downtown areas in places like Wichita or Topeka.
Right, the big cities.
Yeah. But the data shows that almost 39% of the unhoused population in Kansas is located in what's officially called the balance of state, which essentially means the rural and semi-rural areas.
Wait, hold on. 39% in rural areas. That breaks my mental model entirely. I always pictured this as a strictly downtown big city phenomenon where you see encampments on sidewalks.
Yeah, most people do.
How are people surviving in the country where there is practically zero infrastructure for this?
Well, they are surviving through profound invisibility. In rural Kansas, you generally don't have large centralized shelter systems or dedicated outreach teams, so people are relying on informal networks, sleeping in abandoned structures, or hiding off county roads. And the invisibility of that rural population creates a really stark contrast when we look at how different parts of the state actually manage the crisis.
Which flows perfectly into understanding what happens when someone actually seeks out a bed. The disparities across Kansas are frankly massive. Let's look at the reality on the ground. On one end of the spectrum, you have Lawrence. They recently opened a 50-unit pallet shelter village.
And just to clarify for you listening, a pallet village isn't a traditional congregate shelter with bunk beds in a gymnasium. These are individual, climate-controlled cabins meant to act as a transitional space. It gives people privacy, a locking door, and stability.
Exactly. And in Shawnee County, you have the Topeka Rescue Mission, and they are sheltering anywhere from 220 to 240 people nightly. So there are pockets of high capacity. But then you look at Johnson County, which is one of the most affluent areas in the entire state.
Right.
They have 0 year-round, low-barrier emergency shelters. 0.
And the term low barrier is critical there. A low barrier shelter means they do not require extensive background checks, ID, or mandatory sobriety tests just to get a bed for the night. They lower the hurdles to entry to ensure people basically don't freeze.
Right, but in Johnson County, what are the options?
Well, in Johnson County, the only real option is Project 1020, and that is strictly seasonal. It completely closes during the warmer months.
Think about that. If you live in Johnson County and you lose your apartment in May, there is literally nowhere legal for you to go. you are entirely out of luck.
And this creates a major obstacle for people trying to regain stability, because when the shelter system is bottlenecked or just entirely non-existent, depending on which side of the county line you stand on, individuals are trapped outside. And when people are trapped outside, municipalities have to decide how to manage their presence.
Which is where things get incredibly contentious. So if Johnson County has no beds, where do those people sleep tonight? And more importantly, what happens to them when they do?
What happens is they encounter heavy punitive enforcement. Cities across Kansas have enacted severe camping bans. For example, Topeka enacted Ordinance 2544. This bans camping within 100 feet of any public infrastructure and 500 feet of trails.
Wow.
Yeah, and if you violate that ordinance, you are looking at a $500 fine and up to 30 days in jail.
In Wichita allows for the immediate removal of encampments near schools, bridges, and public restrooms without the standard 48-hour notice. But the policy that really stands out to me is Gardner.
Oh, yeah.
The city council there passed a sweeping ban on sleeping in public, and that includes sleeping in parked cars. They did this despite the fact that their broader county, like we just talked about, Johnson County, has no year-round shelter available.
To understand the policy landscape, we have to look at why municipalities are doing this. City councils argue that they are trying to balance public health, manage sanitation, and respond to very real, intense complaints from business owners and constituents about encampments in public spaces.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
Right. They view these ordinances as necessary tools to maintain public order.
But civil rights groups look at this and argue it creates an impossible legal paradox, like the ACLU lawsuit in Lawrence. A man named Brian Griffin was fined $200 and given a 30-day underlying jail sentence simply for resting in downtown Lawrence.
Just for resting.
Just for resting. And the timing is what makes it so egregious. He was cited right around the time the local Lawrence community shelter was forced to turn people away because they had to reduce their capacity from 125 beds down to just 65 beds.
So the shelter couldn't physically take him, but the city legally punished him for not being inside.
Exactly. I have to push back on the logic of these fines, though. Even if a city council says they are doing this for public health and safety, how does fining someone $500 for sleeping outside solve the issue? Like, if they had $500, they wouldn't be sleeping on a sidewalk.
It absolutely doesn't solve it. In fact, advocates point out that this significantly weakens the overall picture for Kansas because it traps people in what is essentially a cycle of marginalization. Let's walk through how that works.
Okay, let's do it.
You get a citation for sleeping outside, which carries a $500 fine. Because you live in poverty, you obviously can't pay it. You miss your court date because you don't have transportation. That unpaid fine instantly turns into an arrest warrant.
So now you have an active warrant hanging over your head.
Exactly. Now, let's say a local outreach worker finally finds you an affordable apartment. You apply, but the landlord runs a background check, sees the active warrant, and denies your application. You are pushed right back onto the street. The enforcement meant to clear the street is the exact mechanism keeping you on it.
Okay, we are about a third of the way through our analysis, and it is time for our draft score. Based on what we've evaluated so far, we are giving Kansas a preliminary grade of a D+ score.
And that draft score is being heavily dragged down by the aggressive municipal enforcement and the wildly uneven shelter access across the state.
But keep in mind, this is just a draft score. It is highly subject to change as we look at how the state handles vehicles and social services. So if sleeping in the park gets you a $500 ticket, a logical survival strategy would be to pool whatever money you have, buy a cheap van or RV, and just sleep in that. But is that actually any safer in Kansas?
Historically, no. There are absolutely no dedicated safe parking programs anywhere in the state.
And for context, a safe parking program is a sanctioned, secure parking lot, usually run by a church or a nonprofit, where people can legally sleep in their cars overnight without the fear of getting a ticket or a knock on the window from police.
But without those programs, the default is criminalization. Wichita and Wyandotte County explicitly define living in a parked car as illegal camping. And Lawrence passed a specific ordinance, Section 17416.2, which bans oversized vehicles from parking near South Park.
Okay, what was the reason for that?
Well, according to advocates, this was enacted to directly target long-term vehicular residents, like a local street musician named Michael Tanner, who had been sheltering there.
Again, we hear cities argue they enact these zoning laws to prevent residential streets from turning into unregulated RV parks. But the result for the unhoused person is constant, exhausting displacement. It's like being stuck on a treadmill where the speed keeps increasing.
That's a great way to put it.
You buy a vehicle to finally get some stable ground and lock your doors, but local zoning forces you to keep driving until you either run out of gas or your home gets impounded. If you try to park an RV on private property in Overland Park or Inman, you run right into strict zoning laws that prohibit full-time residency.
The only brief legal respite comes from the state level, not the cities. The Kansas Department of Transportation allows for 24-hour parking and one night of camping at state rest areas.
But do not try that on the Kansas Turnpike, because they will financially penalize you with a maximum toll fare if you stay longer than 18 hours. So you are forced to be constantly on the move. And if the sidewalks are illegal and your car is being chased out of town by zoning laws, you need an actual apartment.
Which brings us to the core economic driver, the housing market. And the market dynamics here are actively working against the unhoused population. Rents are rising statewide, pushing people who are on fixed incomes entirely out of the market.
Think about your own rent or mortgage for a second. If your housing costs went up 15% tomorrow, you probably have a safety net, savings, credit cards, or family you can lean on. But for someone living paycheck to paycheck in Lawrence or Topeka, that 15% increase is the literal difference between sleeping in a bedroom and sleeping in the backseat of a sedan.
And even when vehicle dwellers try to blend into residential areas to stay safe, bureaucratic policies block them. Like, Lawrence instituted a pilot residential parking permit program. To park on the street in certain neighborhoods, you have to provide proof of residency, like a lease agreement or a utility bill.
Which you wouldn't have.
Right. If your car is your home, you obviously don't have a lease. Therefore, you are locked out of parking in safer neighborhoods.
There is a slight bright spot, though, regarding housing development. Wichita is currently looking to reduce its mandatory parking minimums for developers.
And this is a crucial policy shift. Mandatory parking minimums are laws that require developers to build a certain number of parking spots for every apartment unit.
And building massive concrete parking structures is incredibly expensive. We are talking $10,000 to $20,000 per parking spot. If a city mandates 2 spots per unit, that adds up to $40,000 to the cost of building a basic apartment.
It's a huge burden on developers.
Exactly. By relaxing those rigid zoning codes, Wichita hopes to lower overall development costs, freeing up capital to stimulate the construction of actual affordable housing units instead of empty asphalt.
It is a systemic step forward. But, development takes years. With housing currently unaffordable and survival on the streets heavily penalized, the immediate burden of keeping people alive falls entirely on local grassroots outreach teams.
And their efforts are genuinely incredible. They are the ones actually on the ground doing the heavy lifting. Take Topeka's Compassion Impact Center. They coordinate the Moving Ahead Partnership, or MAP. They aren't sitting in an office waiting for unhoused people to come find them. They are actively deploying mobile medical clinics, mobile showers, and mobile food pantries directly to the encampments.
Yeah, and in Wyandotte County, the Wyandotte Behavioral Health Network runs a low-barrier drop-in center. People can walk in, get a hot shower, do their laundry, and use a computer to apply for jobs without needing an appointment or jumping through bureaucratic hoops.
Oh, that's amazing.
It is. Wichita relies heavily on its homeless outreach team and Project Hope to proactively engage with folks on the street.
But my absolute favorite detail from our sources is the Street Dog Coalition in Topeka. They partner with veterinary students from K-State to provide completely free veterinary care to the pets of unhoused individuals.
Oh, that is so important.
It really is. A lot of people will absolutely refuse to go into a shelter if they are told they have to abandon their dog or cat outside. Their pet is their only companion. By bringing the vet directly to the street, they are building profound trust with a community that has every reason to distrust authority.
And because of these efforts, this becomes one of the state's strongest categories. You have a fascinating dynamic where municipal laws are often hostile, but community-level compassion is stepping into the void with remarkable innovation and dedication.
So the localized outreach is what keeps people alive day to day. But what actually gets them out of homelessness permanently? We have to look at the long-term solutions.
The most effective solutions currently operating in Kansas rely heavily on modern, evidence-based frameworks. Wichita, for example, utilizes a housing-first model through ComCare.
Let me stop you there because I really want to push back on this. The concept of housing first sounds great on paper, but doesn't giving someone a free apartment without requiring them to get sober or go to rehab first just enable their addiction? How do advocates justify handing over keys with no behavioral strings attached?
It is a common critique, but the data strongly supports the model. Traditional approaches required individuals to prove they were housing ready, meaning they had to complete a sobriety program or find a job while living in a shelter before earning an apartment. Housing First flips that completely. It operates on the principle that it is almost biologically impossible to address severe mental health trauma or substance use disorders while you are simultaneously trying to survive a freezing night under an I-70 overpass.
Because your brain is entirely locked into survival mode.
Exactly. Housing First provides the stability of a locking door and a warm bed immediately. Once the person is housed and their nervous system can regulate, the program then wraps clinical and supportive services around them, bringing the addiction specialists, therapists, and job counselors directly to the housing site.
Douglas County is also pushing for these permanent, data-driven solutions. They launched a real-time public dashboard that tracks exactly how people are moving through the shelter and housing systems with the ultimate goal of reaching functional zero for chronic homelessness.
And this helps offset challenges seen elsewhere in the state. It proves that when communities focus their recourses on permanent housing and accurate data, rather than punitive law enforcement, actual measurable progress is possible.
All right, we have covered a massive amount of ground from Seth Yancey's destroyed tent to the intricacies of zoning laws. It is time for the final assessment. To summarize, Kansas exhibits major strengths when it comes to localized, grassroots outreach and progressive housing first programs in specific counties.
Yeah, for sure.
However, it suffers from major glaring weaknesses due to aggressive municipal criminalization of survival and a severe lack of shelter access in affluent areas.
Let us break down the final grades for each category. For housing affordability, Kansas earns a D. Rents are rising, and regulatory barriers like residential parking permits actively lock people out of safe neighborhoods.
Shelter access gets a C-. You have highly effective facilities like the Pallet Village in Lawrence, but total shelter deserts in places like Johnson County, leaving people with nowhere to go.
Criminalization and enforcement receives an F. Relying on steep fines and jail time for people who are simply sleeping outside, especially when no shelter beds are available, creates a cycle of warrants and poverty that is deeply counterproductive.
Vehicle dwelling friendliness gets a D-. There are 0 safe parking programs statewide and a web of zoning laws designed to push vehicular residents out of town.
But outreach and social services earns a B+. The localized grassroots efforts from mobile medical clinics to street-level veterinary care are outstanding and save lives daily.
And Pathways to Permanent Housing gets a C+. Wichita's Housing First model and Douglas County's data dashboard are highly effective, but they desperately need to be scaled statewide.
Which brings us to the final reveal.
The final perfectly homeless state score for Kansas is a 58 out of 100.
And that score is earned because Kansas represents a deep structural dichotomy. On one hand, you have immense community-level compassion. Grassroots outreach teams are working miracles to keep people fed and cared for, but they are constantly fighting an uphill battle against municipal policies that prioritize punishment.
Yeah, they are working at cross purposes.
Exactly. The outreach workers are trying to pull people out of the water, while city ordinances are essentially pushing them right back in.
It really leaves you with a lingering, provocative thought to mull over. Think about the sheer amount of municipal resources and taxpayer dollars spent on enforcing these camping bans. The cost of police hours spent issuing citations, the cost of impounding cars, the daily cost of jailing someone for 30 days, the legal fees for fighting ACLU lawsuits. Could all of that money literally just pay for the permanent housing that would actually solve the problem in the first place?
It is a fundamental question of where a state chooses to invest its resources in managing and punishing the crisis, or in actually ending it.
That's the perfectly homeless state score for Kansas. If you're enjoying the series, please hit like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so we can pester the crap out of you until the series is finished. We'll see you in the next episode. This is a 50-state journey through how America actually treats people without housing, and every state tells a different story. If you'd like to support the project, visit the Perfectly Homeless Etsy store and pick up a PH hoodie. Every purchase helps fund future episodes and keeps these stories in front of the public. Wear the logo. Start a conversation. Because homelessness isn't someone else's problem anymore. It's happening in every state, every city, and more neighborhoods than most people realize. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next state.